Now, what I would like to argue here and present using two texts is that a central characteristic, or maybe the major characteristics of early modern Jewish culture is the canonical status of the Zohar. And I think that really we can demark early Jewish culture by looking at the period starting early 16th century, the process of canonization of the Zohar, and at the end, late 18th century, the beginning of the decanonization of the Zohar. Now I should clarify 2 points. First of all, and that is really related to Yossi's talk, Yossi could say, you could argue, I could put my argument in a different way, speaking not of this canonical status of the Zohar, but the canonical status of Kabbalah, or Luriani Kabbalah. Yet, and that is true, I don't argue with that, yet I think the canonical status or the importance, the centrality of Kabbalah and later Kabbalah at large, 16th century, and from the 17th century, Luriani Kabbalah is dependent on the reception of the Zohar and not vice versa. It's not an openness to Kabbalistic ideas that because of that Zohar becomes central, but various different factors that bring Zohar to be a central text, and because of that we have Kabbalah becoming more central. The second point is a bit of clarification of what I mean when I say canonical, and I'm happy that Ze'ev Gris isn't here to start getting into questions of definition of canonicity. I don't think there's a definition. I don't think there's any essential canonical thing, universal as such. What I mean is the centrality of the text, and especially three points. The formation of the canon, the editing of a corpus called the Zohar, the reception of this text as authoritative, and the wider dispersion of the Zohar. Okay, so these are the things that I will be concentrating on. Now, this I say is characteristics of the early modern period. You can say, well, some of these we have in late Middle Ages, and some of these characteristics we have also in modern period, and that again is true, and I don't think there's completely radical shifts between these periods. Yet, and I will concentrate more on it later. Before the 16th century, we have very small dispersion. There's no canonical formation, and there is a perception. Some circles that perceive the Zohar as authoritative, but they're quite small. Again, looking at the modern period, and nowadays also there are circles in which the Zohar is dispersed, perceived as authoritative, etc. Yet we have also other groups that reject the Zohar. What we have in the early modern period is really a time when the Zohar is perceived almost universally, and of course there's always universally Jewish. I mean, there's always you can always bring some examples that are contrary to that, but it is perceived as part of the Jewish canon alongside the Bible and the Talmud and the Mishnah and other texts. Now I will concentrate using two texts. One from the beginning of this period, the early 2nd century, a text by Rabbi Yehuda Hayat, written in just the first beginning of the 16th century, printed in Mantova in 5058. The date, by the way, is very significant. The date and place, because that is the same year that the Zohar is printed in Mantova. By the way, the next text will be from the end of this period, Yaakov Emden's famous Mitpachat Sfarim, Altona 7069. Towards the end of the 18th century. Now, what I will very shortly try to examine is the question of canon formation, looking at the texts, the question of the authoritative status of the Zohar, the question of the wider dispersion, and I will end very briefly with emphasizing the social context, the social factors that I believe that worked into that, and then I hope to hear more from you that will help me maybe to connect this centrality of the Zohar, which I think is given to other elements, powers, factors that are playing in the early modern period. I will start though with a very short few remarks about Zohar reception in the late Middle Ages, because I think that we need that in order to clarify what happens in the early modern period. First of all, I should emphasize, and think that is something that's accepted by now by all scholars, the Zohar is not a book. The Zohar is a genre, a literary genre, a collection of texts with similarities and differences written in the late 13th and early 14th century by several, I would say at least 3 different authors. What is interesting, I've written about it, that the perception of these texts as a book comes only after the first dispersion of this text. The texts are firstly dispersed, not being perceived as one book. Only from the early 14th century there is the notion of a book called the Zohar. Yet, until the early modern period, nobody knows exactly, there's no consensus, and there's no concrete text which is the Zohar. That is, we have about 100 manuscripts of the Zohar. Almost all of them are different from one another. What I did, I looked also on citations.
So when did you say, does this change? In the
printing of Zohar.
With the printing first change?
Zohar is created by the printers.
So what was the change of reception in the 14th century?
In the 14th century, in the early 14th century, there's the notion that there is a Zohar.
Such a book.
A book. A unit. The notion of the Zohar appears after the writing of the early strata of the Zohar and their dispersion. As if you know, most of the Zohar doesn't, even in the Zoharic texts themselves, most of them, there's no perception of the text as a Zohar. They never call themselves, apart from Tikkunei Zohar, Raya Mehemena, they don't call themselves a Zohar or a book. They don't represent themselves as one literary unit. That comes after the dispersion of the first text.
Not that long after it was...
Not very shortly after, but still I think it's significant that first we have a genre, different texts, and then there's a notion that this is a book. And what happens in the late Middle Ages is that people collect, because they know there's a book, and soon we'll see it in looking at the Chayat, everyone creates his own Zohar. Okay, so that is the no canonical formation. Some look at the text as authoritative. There is the notion of this being an authoritative text, but we're speaking about very small circles, especially in the early 14th century. Almost nobody mentions the Zohar during the 15th century. It almost doesn't exist in Jewish culture, neither in Spain where it was dispersed, nor outside of Spain. Here and there we have mention of the Zohar, but basically, and that goes also to the third point of the circulation and dispersion, this is a very don't want to say not important, but no cultural significance to the Zohar until the early 16th century. And from the late 15th century, early 16th century, we see the change in in all these perceptions. Now, maybe I'll start with the first passages. Would it be okay if I read in Hebrew? It's also Vani Yehuda, beginning of the 16th century. Yehuda Chayat, exiled from Spain. A few years after he arrives in Mantova. Was it? He writes the book. ואני יהודה בן לאדוני החכם וחסיד רבי יעקב חיית עליו השלום בהיותי בספרד טעמתי מעט דבש ואורו עיניי ונתתי אל ליבי לדרוש ולטור בחוכמה והלכתי מחיל אל חיל לאסוף כל מה שימצא מהספר הנזכר ואספתי מעט פה ומעט פה עד שרובו היה בידי מהנמצא ממנו. Okay, this very similar text can be found also in the 14th century, 15th century, and later until the printing of the Zohar. People, he says themselves, I didn't receive one text, but I collected, created my version of the Zohar. So from that point of view, we are still maybe in the late Middle Ages stage of reception of the Zohar. But what is interesting is looking at the citations, what he cites from the Zohar. And looking at that, we see that he has more text than previous scholars that cited in the 14th and the 15th century Zoharic text, and that he perceives more units as being part of the Zohar. Because sometimes in the 14th century we have citations of different strata of the Zohar, they're not all cited as being part of one literary unit. So for him, and here we see already Chayat being part of this early modern canonical collection of the Zohar, by the fact that he has much more units that he perceives as belonging to the Zohar, and that is very typical for other citations of the Zohar of Spanish exiles in the first half of the 16th century. So they have more text, and they perceive Tikkunei Zohar, later Raya Mehemena, the Chayat doesn't know it, Midrash Ne'ela, Midrash Ruth, etc. They perceive them as one literary units, and from that point of view, although, as I said before, Zohar created by the printers, it's not out of the blue. There's a growing consensus of looking at those different strata as being part of one literary unit, and then the printers actually do that and print the first editions of the Zohar. So from print on, we have really this process, or almost termination of this process of canonical formation of the Zohar. We have it in the mid-16th century in Mantova and Cremona between 1557 and 1560, 2 editions of the Zohar, including another volume of Tikkunei Zohar. Later, 1597 in Saloniki, another collection of Zoharic text, and basically that, until our day, that created the Zoharic corpus. Now, it doesn't end, and all the processes, when I'm speaking about canonical status, this is not something static, it's always dynamic. We have small changes in the 17th and 18th century, but largely by the first printers, and during this period we have a canonical unit. People know when they speak about the Zohar, it is a concrete text that they can find in print.
It's so interesting that the recent English edition by Daniel Matt is also a completely new text.
Yes, of course. Now here Daniel Matt is a continuation of the modern deconstruction of the text, again bringing it apart and then looking at Emden, which is, I think, in the border between the early modern period perception of the Zohar and anticipating the modern, in some ways, the modern stance towards the Zohar. Really, if we look at the text that I brought in from the final chapter of Mitpachat Sfarim, he really starts with deconstructing the integrity of the Zohar. Sefer HaZohar Kodesh Kodashim Hu, that's still early modern period phrasing. Danny Matt won't use that phrase, but then he goes on. Gam Sefer Raya Mehemena veHatikunim Mimenu Hu Kemaaser. So they're part, or they're similar, but they're not part of the same text. אלא שהראשון קודם הרבה בזמן ובמעלה, בדור הגאונים חובר. אבל האחרון דווקא חכם מקובל ספרדי היה, כמו שהוכחתי בראיות מופתיות לעיני השמש. Now I'm not interested now in the question of the authority of the Zohar, which soon I will come to, but deconstructing the text. It's not one text. There's Guf Zohar. He starts with this notion of the Zohar itself, that later Sholem adopts, and we all Kabbalah scholars use it, although it's not completely clear what is Guf Zohar, and Tikkunei Zohar and Raya Mehemena. There are different texts. Okay, so here we move from early characterization of the early modern period as having a canonical edition of the text, which we didn't have before, and we have problems with it in the modern period. At least some circles who do not accept the integrity of the Zohar.
What about for narrow audience?
So that's, in a way, that's part of this process that leads to the printing. Now that's very interesting. I don't want to get into it because he started collecting his own collection previous to the printing. Very similar what he includes in the Zohar to the print. On the other hand, he has some problems with the printers. Sometimes he criticizes them, but sometimes he adds to his collection that he starts before and says, this is a portion that now I'm going to interpret that I found only in print. Okay, so we were on the border of this formation of the canonical formation of the Zohar.
I think that the next question is how much fell out and got lost?
Not much. Not much. What is very interesting, and I don't want to get into it now, is contrary to what we perceive as a canonical, this process of canonization, which is excluding, it's clear, and I think that enlightens maybe, although we should be careful about other canonical formation, what drives the people is inclusion and not exclusion. But mostly they put everything they find inside. And that goes on in the 17th day. Oh, I found another, okay, that's Zohar. And something to say, I'm not sure it's Zohar, but let's include it in the edition. So it's very contrary to what I perceived, at least, about canonical formation. I have my explanations for that, but that's beside the point. Second point, authoritative status of the Zohar. Again, we have some expression of the authority of the Zohar previously, mostly in doctrinal matters. Some also we have in the Rekanati, some other sources that look at the Zohar as authoritative in questions of minhag and halacha. Again, very small circles, isolated Kabbalists, mostly in Spain. Since the late 15th century, and especially during the 16th century, we have the establishment of the authority of the Zohar. And that comes through explicit declaration of its authority, both in doctrinal and practical issues. And the central expression of using the Zohar as a source of authority is citations. It seems maybe somewhat trivial, but I think that is the sign of, that's the practical application of the authority of the Zohar. And if you look at texts written, mostly Kabbalistic texts, but not only in the 16th century, every page will find, from the Chayat, Cordovero, Meiri ben Gabbai, whoever you like, will find every page citations of this point I cite from the Zohar, this point I cite from the Zohar, and what we have in that period also, citations of Zohar also in, not only in Kabbalistic texts, but also in legal halachic texts. Now, again, a text here, which excellent text to show a very influential declaration of the authority of the Zohar. This is the third passage from Rabbi Yehuda Chayat, introduction, early 16th century, and he says, ואם באולי תאמר כי בחוכמה הזאת יימצאו לפעמים דברים זרים אל השכל, and by the way, חוכמה הזאת isn't, and we'll see it later, that's not Kabbalah. It's חוכמה הזאת, the חוכמה of ספר הזוהר, the Kabbalah of the Zohar. כמו שאמר הקדוש האלוקי רבי שמעון בן יוחאי ז"ל, לא כל מוחה ומוחה סביל היי אלא אינם קדישים חכמים וכולי. על כל פנים, יש לנו להאמין בדבריה אמונה שלמה, כי לא דבר ריק הוא, ואם ריק הוא, ממנו הוא. וצריך שנטה לבנו על כורחנו לקבל דבריה באמת ובלב שלם, ולעשותם עטרה לראשנו, ולומר תאמיני ליבי או תשמי לי, האמן במה שהאמין הקדוש האלוקי, בוסינא דנהורה, תפארת התנאים ונזר החכמים, עדיף מנביא רבי שמעון בן יוחאי ז"ל וחבריו. I don't think you can declare the authority of a text in stronger terms than that. This is the criteria for truth.
Didn't he say that it was composed in the time of the Gaonim?
No, that was Emdim. That was Emden. That was Emden. Yeah. It's one text. That's Chayat Emden. That would be the. Okay. So really very strong formulation of authority of the Zohar. Even if I do not incline to believe, I must take heed to what the Zohar says. Interestingly, by the way, this is a paraphrase. The last portion is a paraphrase of the Bedershi, Rabbi Yedaya Hapnini, at the end of Bechinat Olam, which was printed several years before Rabbi Yehuda Chayat wrote it, that he says the same things, but about the Rambam. So it's I didn't bring the text, but it's exactly the same wordings, but instead of the Rambam, we have here the Zohar.
Both from the longer text and from the Talmud text before it, their insistence implies that there's also tremendous opposition to what they're trying to do. So just because you declare it holy doesn't make it holy. And there's obviously people who don't agree with you.
Well, I believe that declaring something holy, that's the expression of but of course, there is a context to that, and I will come later to that. What is interesting is that we don't have the text that, as you summarized, there's something very apologetic here, but the text that attacked the Zohar, the circles that attacked the Zohar, almost did not survive. But that again, this is the early period. Okay, so here I think the emphatic rhetorics here is indeed the context of the background for this establishment of the Zohar as authoritative. Okay. Now, in this text, Chayat speaks about doctrinal matters of theory, theology, etc. Yet we have at the same, and by the way, before that I should say, very influential and this is one text, but other states very similar, they're about, I collected them, they're very similar during the first half of the 16th century. Again, all of them Spanish exiles, very similar formulations, some of them independent and some of them dependent on the Chayat's sayings. Now, this text is in the context of the doctrinal matters, yet we have at the same period, again amongst Sephardic exiles, we have similar, slightly different declaration of Zohar authority in matters of halakha and minhag. Okay, and here the best known, and I didn't bring it here because I'm concentrating on the Chayat, but that is of course Karo's inclusion of the Zohar and citation of the Zohar and declaration of the Zohar authority in halachic matters, bringing the famous rule that says that if the Zohar does not contradict the Talmud, we should heed to what it says. Now, I think that wasn't emphasized enough. People, of course, Katz and Chalamish and Tashma and Bnei and others wrote about it, but I think wasn't emphasized enough that this posits not the Zohar as inferior to the Talmud, not only, that is true, but puts declares the Zohar to be superior to all of the other poskim. Okay, and that is very central, I think. It brings the Zohar is more authoritative than any posek, including, I put in brackets here, including, and that I think what is directed against, including the tool, the Rosh and the tool. I think that's what's the issue here.
Has it been followed?
Pardon? Was it followed? It was followed by almost all Sephardic poskim or Sephardic influenced poskim influenced by Sephardic culture. There is here a resistance amongst Ashkenazim, before that also amongst Italians and Romanoids scholars to this ruling, and mostly amongst the Ashkenazim to that. Yet, although they don't accept this rule, and they do not posit the Zohar as superior to the poskim, there's a lot of influence and consideration of the Zohar also amongst Ashkenazim in Hag and Halacha. I think even the first text who collect a Zoharic texts that deal with Halacha matters were collected and printed by Ashkenazim and not by Sfardim in the early 17th century. Okay, so we have this gradual exception. I started reading in the 16th century. During the 16th, late 16th, 17th, 18th century, this authority of the Zohar is accepted as, again, almost universally, Jewish universally in Jewish communities, with this difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, considering the question of the status of the Zohar in comparison to the poskim. Again, this is something which changes in the late 18th century. And again, Emden here, although his background, I think that the context of his attack is different than what we will find in the Enlightened period, but it's the same thing of, I think Emden says it, will say it better than I, in the second page in the passage 4. ועתה ידע האיש הישראלי הנאמן לאלוהיו כי אין חיוב אמונה בכל מה שנמצא בספר הזוהר שבדפוס, גם לא בכל מה שבא בכתבים והעתקות משם הארי. Okay, so contrary to Chayat, now it says, no, you do not have to accept as authoritative what the Zohar says. ועיין בהקדמת הרמב"ן בפירושו לתורה, and סוף דבר, תאמין ליבי בדברי המקובלים, או תסמיל בספרים חיצוניים, חכמים וחידותם, במופלא ממך בל תדרוש, במכוסה ממך בל תחקור, ואל בינתך אל תישען, אל תהי חכם בעיניך כבדרשי, סוף הספר בחינת עולם. And here he relates to what I mentioned before, בדרשי's saying concerning the Rambam. So don't take the Rambam as authoritative. ולבך לא ימהר להוציא דבר לפני האלוהים, כבעל נשמת חיים, סוף הספר. And here, by the way, he's speaking about Moshe ben Israel, Nishmat Chaim. At the end of the book, he brings a paraphrase of the words that we read, of the Chayat's words. So don't accept not the Bedershi, not the Chayat. I brought it, again, I think there's much more into the text to discuss, but in second half of the 18th century, we have circles that say, no, we should not accept the Zohar as authoritative. Okay, I leave for later the question of the emergence of enlightenment and their position, which is close but related, but different on the other aspects from that of Emden. Why the circulation of the Zohar and the cultural impact? The third point. Again, as I said before, very small dispersion previous to the 16th century, from the early modern period, and then again, this is a gradual process. We find wider circulation, both geographically, but also socially. That is, Zohar is dispersed amongst larger communities, in geographical areas where it wasn't known before that, but also arrives into social strata that weren't aware of the Zohar, or the text was close to them previous to the 16th century. The wider the circulation, there are various practices that through that this dispersion is made. One of them, even before the printing, is citations. Okay, lots of books that cite, and also after the printing, this is a way of reaching larger audiences. And of course, and I won't get into that, the question is in what kind of books cite the Zohar. But of course, as we have citations in more popular books, wider strata of the society know at least some passages from the Zohar. Of course, the most effective way is the printing of the Zohar itself, and I mentioned that before. We have it in the mid-16th century, we have 2 editions. Interestingly, only in the 17th century, only 2 editions, same as in the 16th century. What we have, a very impressive growth in the 18th century, where we have 14 editions of the Zohar printed, and 11 editions of Tikkunei Zohar that wasn't printed at all during the 17th century. So here, and again, speaking about early modern period, I think there are a lot of differences between different geographical areas and periods in this period, and there is a very interesting shift between the 17th and the 18th century, but still we can see that somehow a process of dispersion already characterizing in a more mild fashion already the 16th century. So I said citations, print, anthologies. We were speaking before that about the anthologies appearing from the early 17th centuries. We have anthologies of the Zohar, some translations. Again, 18th century, late 17th, 18th century, we have the first translations of the Zohar, printed translations into the vernacular, mostly printed at least only into Yiddish. We have in manuscripts also to Ladino. And one of the most impressive, I think, way or effective way of introducing the Zohar to a larger public, and that is again something that Yossi spoke about, the introduction of Zoharic portions insertion of Zoharic portions into the liturgy. You mentioned Brich Shmei, Patach Eliyahu, we have that, and the growing, again, from the mostly 17th century, of special rituals that include a recitation of the Zohar. Tikkun Leil Shavuot, Hoshana Rabbah, Leila Brit, many others, like Ba'omer you mentioned, many other texts. Yeah, just I can go on and count those special liturgical, the tikkunim that include expressed from the Zohar. That's something that. Okay. Now I spoke about geographic dispersion. First, we have that early 16th century almost only restricted to the Sephardic diaspora. In the mid-16th century, we have, and here again, this is a question that much work has to be done, the reception amongst Italian Jewry. And later, from the 16th century, we have the reception amongst all the areas in which Sephardic culture became dominant, and also amongst Ashkenazi culture. Social dispersion. While at the beginning we see it mostly amongst elite strata in the different geographical areas, we have, again, mostly from the 17th century and 18th century, we have the dispersion amongst the wider social strata. And that is done through the anthologies, through the translations, through the liturgical use. What characterizes the period and is related is the arguments. Here we have a conflict which is pro or anti the dispersion and the printing. But again, this discussion is done in the context of accepting the Zohar as central. Some will say, okay, central, but only should be restricted to the elite. Others will work in trying to bring it into larger social strata. And here again, I would like to look at the text, which, and I don't have time to go on, but the question is how to justify. Because here we have the struggle and the attempt of dispersing the Zohar, and we have the notion of it being an esoteric text, there are different ways of explaining how can we, and different strategies, how can we disperse or open an esoteric text to larger social strata. One of the most famous ones, and again that you mentioned, is the Messianic ideology. Okay, this is a period. Now it is permitted to open the text. And the fifth passage, "Ashreinu matov chelkenu shezachinu el sefer hazohar." Mentioned Lag BaOmer, by the way. This phrase appears in one of the songs that are sung in the Hilula.
I'm sorry, can you...
Fifth passage. מה שלא זכו קדמוננו, אשר קוטנם עבה ממותננו, כמו רב היי גאון ורב ששת גאון והרב אליעזר מגורמייזה והרמב"ן והרב"ד והרשב"א וחכמים אחרים זולתם, שלא טעמו מדובשו כי בזמנם לא נתגלה. And I will go to the end. והנה מבואר מכאן שהחיבור הזה היה עתיד להיות גנוז, ובאותו זמן התהנו ממנו העליונים, והם המלאכים עד שיבוא דרה בתראה, שאז יתגלה לתחתונים, ובזכות העוסקים והמטפלים בו יבוא משיח. כי תמלא הארץ דעה את השם בסיבתו, אשר זה יהיה סיבה קרובה לביאתו, וזה שאמר, ובגיני ושבתם איש אל אחוזתו, etc. Okay, so it's not only a sign of Messianic age, but the study, the dispersion of the Zohar will enhance the coming of the Messiah. Now again, I think I look at it as a strategy of opening the text and justifying that by saying Today, in our days, this is permitted, and by the way, also in contemporary Kabbalistic circles, the same reason are used for opening popularization of the Zohar.
So why is the populace wanted? Why is the populace?
Well, first of all, I don't know if they are in this period. I don't think in the early 16th century they are so open to that. Now, I think in every culture, hegemonic circles are those who direct the public acceptance of things. So I think this is directed from above. It's not in the power of the mass.
Succeed.
Yeah, the question is why?
Why does that succeed?
Yeah.
Because I think you accept culture themes that are dictated by the persons we see as authoritative. Why do we read some? But okay, we won't get into that. But I think
you can answer that. They believe that this is first of all a midrash, like any other midrash, and it has no. You have even here the use of the word midrash in one of the texts that you brought. And they call it a midrash. No, I don't know if this question means that you never read the Zohar. I don't know. Because, the point is, I don't want to be, but the point is that the Zohar is a tremendous book. So what's the point? Why did it succeed? It's really a masterpiece. So the point is, no, really.
I don't know what is a masterpiece. I think.
No, in my opinion. Okay.
And being a masterpiece is also something that is socially constructed. And what I'm showing is, what I'm trying to work here is the social construction of this text.
We're giving me an intellectual answer, which has a certain utility, but I'm asking for a social answer.
Okay, maybe I'll try and then I'll speak. I don't know if it will be an answer. At least I will try to enumerate the different social factors that play the role. And then I think we have to think exactly what happens here. Now the question is how much it was succeeding. In what way was it succeed? It's not that people really what's being open, what's receiving the Zohar. It's a very difficult question. Is it studying? Is it reciting it without understanding? The very different ways of receptions of the Zohar. So it's not one, and I think all of them have different answers. So again, I'm really doing very large brushes here, and each one of them involves very different social factors that are coming together and pushing the Zohar as a central text. Now, here is one justification, one strategy of saying, well, in our days it is permitted to open this book. Still, you can say, open the book, you don't know Aramaic, what can you do with that? So other strategies are translation, anthologies. The notion, one way of overcoming this notion, this is esoteric, especially as we have Chaim Vital saying in this introduction, nobody can really understand it apart from Luria. So one of the interesting things, and we discussed it before, the notion that there is a pshat and sod of the Zohar. There are different levels. And a lot of what the larger public receives is really the Agadot. Is what is considered the pshat of the Zohar, and not the stories from the Zohar, and not the more doctrinal, sephirotic, etc. Matters. Another very interesting strategy, and I think the most powerful one, is saying this text is so sacred that basically you cannot understand it. Nonetheless, it is significant enough or powerful enough that only if you recite that is beneficial. That is powerful, and this stands, I think, behind a lot of the integration of the Zohar into liturgy, and that is very interesting because it has a double edge here of playing. On the one hand, it disperses the Zohar. Many more people know, almost everyone that prays knows portions from the Zohar. Nonetheless, almost nobody can try and understand what it says. Because it's so sacred, don't even try to understand it. We have the Gurion Kabbalists, who, of course, they know also the meaning of this sacred text. Now,
We're in the middle of. I'm sorry.
Okay, I just finished the point here, and then no, I won't read the passage, although it's a good one. But here we have a dialectical process, because this dispersion of the Zohar, why the dispersion, and then here we have the Sabbatianists playing a very central role in that, in the end brings a reaction of circles that again are calling for a more esoteric perception of the Zohar and saying, and here again we have pushing towards the modern area, although from a different stance of saying, no, listen, this text should be held only amongst the elite, don't read it, let's drop it, let's not discuss it, etc. And that can be found in the text, the final text, which I will not read now. Now, I would just like to maybe quickly to conclude. So I don't know if you want to insert your question now or later.
Actually, I was going to respond again to my friend and neighbor and colleague in the same way that I wanted to respond a little bit early in terms of the social appeal, but why don't you just finish?
Okay, okay. Now, what I would like to conclude, looking at the social factors, but just a few words about the Zohar status in the early modern period. Again, we have this notion, the early modern period, a notion of centrality of the Zohar is still maintained in the modern period amongst many circles until today. Yet, what we do find is, although there were criticisms of the Zohar previous in the early modern period, they were very, very isolated and did not have any cultural significance. What we have with the emergence of the Enlightenment and the creation of modern Jewish culture, or modern Jewish cultures, is the deconstruction of the canonical integrity of the Zohar, the rejection of its authority, and hence, from those two things, what is implied is a completely, I think, erasing of the cultural significance of impact of the Zohar. And in a way, if we look at modernist Judaisms, I think that is one of the signs that you can say, and that will go even in differences amongst Orthodox different groups, is we have modern groups who reject the Zohar, we have, I don't know how to call them because they're also modern, but a different type of adoption of modern values by the stance towards the Zohar. Do we accept it as wholly sacred, authoritative, or do we not?
So is Madonna
modernist? Madonna is postmodern. Okay, and we won't get into postmodern, but I think here we have this really differentiation, which we see also in very other circles that are trying to return to the Zohar now from a very interesting stance, which I think is not the traditional one and not the modern one. Okay. No, I think this decanonization of the Zohar is very important in the creation of modernity, and also emphasize the importance of the Zohar as a central text in the early modern period. Because in a way, what the Enlightenment, the people of the Haskalah, try to do is to distinguish and to create a new culture that is distinguished from early modern period. And that was done on the decolonization of the Zohar was a central element of this new construction of Jewish identity without the centrality of the Zohar.
To what extent did Christians preserve the canonization of the Zohar after
Wait. Pour out of it.
Okay.
Oh, we didn't finish it. Right, it's really the Rabbis that needs to be mentioned more than Eliot, but I'm just serving as the vehicle for mentioning these Rabbis. In a very important volume edited by Bernie Cooperman, namely the Jewish thought of the 16th century, there's an essay by Jake Katz, which cites a responsum of Rabbi David Ben Zimmer, which I think is one of the most illuminating comments that we have from the early modern period about the appeal of Kabbalah. Somewhat jaded, but also illuminating. The responsum of Rabbis deals with a rather obscure question in Jewish custom, namely, why is it that for the additional service on Rosh Chodesh, on the new moon, it is customary to remove tefillin, that is, tefillin are worn for Shacharit, for the early service, and removed before Musaf. And Rabbaz answers there. He first of all cites on one hand, he does his own work and cites the text, namely the book that's been referred to today as the Sefer HaKaneh, which he calls El Kaneh, or Al Kaneh. And so he says, but of course he knows that the people in the late 16th or early 17th century who are removing their tefillin before Musaf on the new moon are not doing it because it appears in the unpublished HaKaneh. And then he says, it's because they want to appear like the Kabbalists. That is to say, he has a very clear sense that there is a kind of cachet associated with the level of piety that Kabbalists represent. And following Kabbalistic custom allows one to appear that way. Of course, one can think of many examples today. I'll refer to those black hats that prevent us from keeping our luggage in the racks above our seats on El Al. That's big black fedoras, the bigger the better, right? Just it's sort of emblems of piety, something you can just go to a store, buy, and transform your identity. And I think it's rather interesting, as I said, that neither I nor Jacob Katz, but it's Rataz who first refers to the sort of emblematic role that certain practices can have. And so therefore the so-called, what I guess someone, David Berger or someone over here would call the firmer than thou approach in Jewish life, which is well known in the 20th and 21st century, certainly has certain manifestations in the 16th and 17th, and Kabbalah, for of course that's only part of the answer, but nonetheless it's clear to the participants that Kabbalah serves as a kind of shortcut to identifying with the form of piety which is seen as sort of more authentic or intense than other kinds. So it is true that there is the intellectual competition between rabbinites and Kabbalists, but it also is true that there is a kind of battle in Jewish society about who is closest to God and who has a higher form of piety in some way in Kabbalah.
Okay. Yeah, but that's, again,
Can I
that's
make a suggestion?
to receive this dominant position in Jewish culture is because, on the one hand, this is a Sephardic text. It was written in Spain. On the other hand, because of its pseudepigraphic nature, it is perceived as a Mishnaic. And a Mishnaic in that period is a universal Jewish text. And this is, I think, the value that the Zohar has. Okay, on the one hand, reflecting Jewish norms, Jewish Sephardic norms and doctrines, etc. On the other hand, being perceived as not a Sephardic text, but an ancient universal text. The other factor is the contribution of Christian Hebraists and Kabbalists to the formation of the Zohar. Okay, and they are involved in the creation of the corpora. Many of the manuscripts were created for and collected by Christian Hebraists. They take an active role in the printing of the Zohar, not only in Mantova and Cremona, but later also in the 17th century in the Sulzbach edition. The Noah von Rosenroth is behind that. Okay, and here again, I think what is the cultural value of the Zohar? Again, it being a text that is perceived as pre-Talmudic. And there's an openness and interest in the text from Christian circles. Maybe the most important is the print and print capitalism and cultural agents that are involved with the print. And here we have a lot of economic interest in the dispersion of the Zohar. And here again we have to play, and I think there's interesting playing about dispersing the text, but not, and by that establishing its value, but not causing an inflation. Okay, because if the text will be too much open, too much popular, it loses its social value. And here we have all those plays about Pshat and Sod in the Zohar, or sanctity that, on the one hand, okay, we'll print it and you'll have it at home, but you don't have to understand it. And these are very interesting strategies. The last one that I mentioned, and I'll finish here, is Sabbatinist, which I mentioned sometimes, but of course they have an enormous role, especially in the of course, in the 18th century, in the dispersion of the Zohar from their own reasons here, and I won't get into that, but that's another factor. So we have different factors that again play, sometimes from different reasons, but all of them together are really pushing the Zohar to be such a central text in this period.
Let me just take advantage of my own position to ask a quick question and also invite if there are other people. I just, several people here have heard me speak about this, but I just finished the article about De Lattis, one of De Lattis' sermons. Now, De Lattis is one of the guys who's involved in it. He is not Sephardi, right? He gives a sermon in Bologna to a community that is, the people he's speaking to are at least partially and probably mostly not Sephardi. He gives a sermon that is aimed at making them pay money, something they don't want to do. That is, it has to be a high motivational sermon. It is a sermon which is directed at a point of real economic and social tension in the Jewish community of Bologna. I am virtually certain it was given Parshat Shemot 1559. Okay, so in other words, I can't be sure that year, but I'm almost sure of that year. The sermon contains not just references to the Zohar or to the Tikkunei Zohar specifically, but lengthy quotes from it. And I'm convinced that those lengthy quotes are not just added in the written version, but are integral to the point of the sermon and therefore must have been delivered at least in translation in some way. We are not talking about ritual, we are not talking about anthology, we're not talking about Maisalach, about Luria. We are not talking about a popularized set of practices. We are talking about a highly intellectualized, very Cordoveran, if it is, but Zoharic and Tikkunei Zoharic text in 1559, which is used at a moment of social tension, when it's important that the people really understand what you say and are moved, or not understand, but are moved by it. I don't see how that fits in. Quite frankly, I don't understand why the Malechet HaLakut was popular, because I find it unintelligible. Maybe the Zohar is a great book, but I suspect most people didn't understand it either. And I still don't think, I think Moshe's question still remains. Why was this thing at the moment so effective that it's not just effective iconically? I agree that it became iconic or emblematic or whatever term we want to use. That's clear. I agree the stories had a thing. But there's something else going on here, and I'm not sure we touched it.
I would like to read that and look at that. Again, I'm not sure exactly on what you're trying to find, and I'm not sure if it's out there to find. You see, if you're trying to say that there's an impact of the ideas that are so, I think it's the impact of, here we have a newly found ancient text, and there is the need of several, and Yaakov de Lattis is very interested because he's involved in the printing, and that's a very important economic endeavor. And if you ask why was the Malechet Elohut printed? Twice, by the way, in the same year, I think because of the introduction I brought here. Because that was preparing the market for the publication of the Zohar. That's not, I don't see any, because Malechet Elohut is
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I've been told we're done. Lunch! Where do we go? We go back to